In front of his brightest engineers, the millionaire CEO decided to humiliate the cleaning lady. Pointing to an impossible equation on the board, he mocked, "If you solve this, I'll marry you." The whole room laughed. His smile vanished when she calmly picked up the marker and in 10 seconds wrote the answer. A shocked silence took over everyone. Before the CEO could speak, the CFO stood up, pale, and said, "Congratulations, ma'am. You were..." And the revelation he made next showed that she was not a cleaning lady, but the only person they all should fear. The quantum tech war room, etched into the pulsing financial heart of Lower Manhattan, was a sanctuary of glass and steel that, at that moment, seemed ready to implode under the weight of silence. The air, usually vibrant with the energy of innovation and imminent profit, was dense, almost unbreathable. Robert "Rob" Sterling, the multimillionaire CEO who had built an empire from algorithms and a near-prophetic audacity in the stock market, stared at a glass whiteboard dominating the main wall. His eyes, which typically shone with the certainty of someone who turns ideas into fortune, were dull, fixed on the complex equation that had become the symbol of his failure. Those numbers and symbols represented a dead end, a fatal flaw in his new and revolutionary encryption algorithm, a project into which the company had sunk massive capital. His top engineers, young prodigies recruited at a premium from MIT and Stanford, remained silent, shoulders slumped, their youthful arrogance replaced by palpable exhaustion. Billions of dollars in investment and the impeccable reputation of quantum tech, a behemoth on the stock exchange, depended on the solution that no one there could find. In the middle of this charged atmosphere, the glass door slid open smoothly, and Anna Reed, the floor custodian, entered with her cleaning cart. Her movements were discreet, almost invisible, a silent choreography of efficiency learned over years. She emptied the trash cans with a dignity that contrasted sharply with the room's feverish anxiety. Exhausted, humiliated, and desperately needing a target for his monumental frustration, Robert spotted her. He saw her pause for a brief, nearly imperceptible second, her tired but notably lucid eyes resting on the board. A cruel, slow, and venomous smile crossed Robert's face. It was the perfect opportunity to deflect attention from his own incompetence. "Enjoying the art, darling?" he asked, his voice loud and laced with scorn. Projected so every engineer present would hear and feel complicit. Nervous, uncomfortable chuckles echoed through the room. "Do you know what this is?" he continued, lifting his chin, the predator playing with his prey. "It's what separates the geniuses, the ones who build billion-dollar fortunes, from people like you. But you know what? Today I'm feeling generous." He gestured theatrically toward the equation that tormented the nation's brightest minds. "Solve this, and I'll marry you. Ha ha ha." The room exploded in louder, more confident mockery, a collective relief that they were not the target. Anna did not react to the humiliation. Her shoulders didn't drop. Her face didn't flinch. With disconcerting calm, she set the garbage bag on the floor, walked with firm steps to the conference table, and picked up the red dry erase marker lying abandoned there. "What are you—" Robert began to say, his mocking smile freezing on his face, a strange premonition creeping up his spine. In less than 10 seconds, Anna was at the board. With surgical precision, she crossed out 3 entire lines of Robert's complex equation and immediately below wrote a single, elegant, short line of mathematical code. Then she tossed the marker back onto the table with a dry click and resumed holding her trash bag. The silence that followed was total, heavier and more deafening than the tension before. It was a vacuum filled with shock and incredulity. The chief engineer, Liam Murphy, a pale young man with thick glasses, was the first to move. He raced to the board, his tablet trembling in his hands as he checked the numbers. His eyes widened. "My God," he stammered, his voice failing. She simplified the matrix. She used a vector field theorem that isn't even taught here. This is correct." This solves everything. Robert went white as a sheet. The air knocked from his lungs. He looked from the serene figure of the custodian to the brilliant solution on the board, public humiliation draining every drop of color from his face. Before he could articulate a single word, Steve Harris, the chief financial officer, the oldest and most respected man in the room, slowly rose from his chair. With a solemnity that silenced any remaining doubt, he began to clap. Stephen didn't look at Robert. His eyes were fixed on Anna, with an expression of profound relief and admiration. "Congratulations, Doctor," he said, his voice firm and clear. "You have been approved." Robert, utterly lost, terrified by a reality he didn't comprehend, whispered the question hanging in the air like a sentence. "Doctor." Stephen finally turned his cold gaze toward the CEO. "Robert, this is Dr. Eleanor Vance, the theoretical physicist the Zurich board hired to conduct the final audit of your leadership. She demanded to come undercover for a week to see who you truly were. And now we have all seen." The echo of Stephen's applause died away, but the vibration of his words lingered, hanging in the air like a toxic fog for Robert. Dr. Eleanor Vance. The name hit him with the force of a punch to the gut, stealing his breath and color. He looked at the woman who still held the trash bag, and the image dissolved in his mind. The grey uniform, the simply tied-back hair, the hands that seemed calloused from manual labor, everything became a facade, a cruel fantasy designed to trick him. The woman he saw now was different. Her posture, once submissive, was now erect, radiating unshakable confidence. The look he had presumed to be exhaustion was, in fact, cold, penetrating analysis. He wasn't the hunter, he was the prey, and he had just fallen into the most humiliating trap of his life. His engineers, the young geniuses he was so proud to lead, now stared at him with a mixture of astonishment, pity, and undisguised dread. Their laughter, which had validated him moments before, now haunted him, each echo a fresh stab at his shattered ego. His empire, built with a sharp business acumen and aggressive management of his vast fortune, suddenly seemed fragile, a house of cards ready to tumble. Stephen, with the calm of a general on conquered territory, made a subtle gesture with his hand. "Gentlemen, I appreciate everyone's effort. The problem is solved. You may leave. We will reevaluate the project timeline tomorrow." The order was given in a soft tone, but carried a final authority no one dared question. The room emptied in an awkward silence, the engineers hurriedly exiting, avoiding Robert's furious glare and Dr. Vance's enigmatic gaze. In seconds, the three were alone in the epicenter of the disaster. The whiteboard, with Eleanor's elegant solution in bright red over Robert's desperate scribbles, was a monument to his arrogance. He felt cold sweat trickling down his forehead. Years of high-stakes negotiations, of bold stock market bets yielding millions in profit and dividends, hadn't prepared him for this kind of defeat. This wasn't about money. It was about the annihilation of his identity. I don't understand," Robert stammered, his voice unrecognizable, weak. "An audit? The Zurich board approved my expansion plan. Our stock has never been higher." Stephen sighed. "A sound of fatherly disappointment. Robert, the board admires your capacity to generate wealth. Your cash flow is impressive. But there are growing concerns about your leadership, about the culture you've created. A company isn't just made of assets and liabilities, it's made of people." That was when Anna moved. She placed the trash bag neatly beside the door with unexpected delicacy. Then she turned and walked slowly toward him, her rubber-soled shoes making a soft sound on the polished floor. She stopped a few feet away, and for the first time, she spoke. Her voice held neither anger nor triumph. It was calm, controlled, and sharp as a scalpel. "For 1 week, I cleaned up your mess, Mr. Sterling. I listened to how you treat your subordinates when you think no one important is watching. I saw how fear, not inspiration, drives this team. Every word was a verdict. Robert opened his mouth to defend himself, to apologize, to plead, but no sound came out. What could he say? The truth had been exposed brutally. He was a successful billionaire, a financial genius, but as a human being, he had just failed the most important test of his life. Eleanor looked at Stephen and then back at Robert, her face an impenetrable mask of professionalism. Stephen has my preliminary report. The Zurich board will be informed within the hour. She paused, letting the weight of that sentence settle upon him. Tomorrow, 9 a.m., in this room, we will have a meeting. I ask that you come prepared to discuss the terms of your departure from the presidency of Quantum Tech. The glass door slid shut with a soft, final hiss that sealed Robert's fate. He stood alone in the war room, now transformed into his personal mausoleum. The silence, once a sign of respect and subordination, was now a shroud suffocating him. For a long minute, he didn't move, his body paralyzed by shock, his mind a tempest of denial and fury. The adrenaline that had sustained him throughout his life of aggressive business and high-stakes decisions now converted into a cold poison running through his veins. He looked at the whiteboard, at Eleanor's elegant line of code, a red flourish that mocked his hours of labor, his supposed genius. The humiliation was a burning ember in his chest. With a roar of pure frustration, he picked up a heavy acrylic eraser from the table and hurled it against the glass. The object hit with a dull thud and fell to the floor, harmless, without leaving a single mark on the equation that had condemned him. That simple act of impotence was more devastating than any explosion of rage. His power, his ability to mold the world to his will, had vanished. He stumbled to his chair, the Italian leather chair that cost more than Anna's annual salary, and collapsed into it. His empire. Quantum Tech was more than a business. It was an extension of himself. Every floor of that building, every humming server, every line of code that generated astronomical profit was a brick in the fortress of his identity. He built this fortune from nothing, with a voracious intelligence and a lack of scruples that the financial market called vision. He transformed a small initial investment into a net worth of billions, dominating the stock market with terrifying precision. And now, a custodian, a doctor, had dismantled him in less than 10 seconds with a dry erase marker. The fury gave way to a cold panic. This couldn't be happening. He wouldn't allow it. He had allies, people who owed their careers, their own fortunes, to him. He grabbed his smartphone, the object that was the center of his power, and dialed the personal number of Heinrich, the board chairman in Zurich, a man with whom he had played golf, shared expensive wines, and closed deals that moved euros like pocket change. The phone rang twice. Heinrich's voice, when he answered, wasn't that of the friend, but of the Swiss executive, cold and distant as the Alps. Robert, Heinrich, you won't believe what happened here. It's ridiculous, a setup. This woman, this Eleanor Vance, Robert began, desperate. Heinrich interrupted him, the politeness in his voice as sharp as an ice blade. I know exactly what happened, Robert. I just spoke with Stephen and received Dr. Vance's preliminary report. The board is in an extraordinary session. Robert felt the floor disappear beneath his feet. What? But we're friends. Heinrich, the stock, the dividends. I gave you everything. Business is business, Robert, and the stability of our investment is paramount. A company's leadership isn't measured solely by its stock price. I regret this. The call ended. The final beep sounded like a death sentence. He looked at the framed picture on his desk, an old photo of him smiling next to his father, a bricklayer, on his graduation day from MIT. The pride in the old man's eyes was the driving force of all his ambition. What would his father say now? The billionaire looked at his trembling hands, the same ones that signed million-dollar checks. They were empty. Suddenly, his phone vibrated, A new email notification. The sender was Stephen. The subject, Transition Protocols Confidential. With his heart pounding against his ribs, he opened the email. There was a single attachment, a PDF detailing every step of his removal, including the communication strategy with the press and the succession plan. And then he saw the file creation date 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks. The plan for his corporate execution had been underway for 2 weeks. The realization hit him not like lightning, but like a slow, cold flood, filling his lungs, drowning any lingering hope of fighting the tide. Eleanor's audit wasn't a test. It was the final formality, the theater stage to justify a decision already made. His arrogance, his outburst of mockery in the war room, wasn't the cause of his downfall, but merely the final nail in his coffin. He felt like a fool, a puppet in a game whose rules he completely ignored. Stephen, the man he considered a mentor, a docile old lion who managed the finances with silent competence, was the architect of his ruin. The image of Stephen's relieved smile when congratulating Anna returned to his mind, and now he understood its depth. It wasn't relief over the algorithm's solution. It was relief that Robert had finally hanged himself with the very rope they had given him. The feeling of betrayal was so overwhelming that it supplanted the humiliation. He had trusted Stephen, sharing with him not just cash flow projections and investment strategies, but also his dreams for the company. How many times, in that very room, had they toasted success, the acquisition of yet another competitor, the exponential increase of his wealth? He stood up and began to pace, nervous energy propelling him. The room, once a symbol of his power, now seemed like a cage. Every luxury object, the solid mahogany table, the designer chairs, the panoramic view of Manhattan stretching below, seemed to mock him. They were just goods, cold assets listed on his net worth statement, but they offered no comfort, no loyalty. He thought about his life, a relentless climb, fueled by coffee, little sleep, and an insatiable hunger for more. More money, more power, more recognition. He sacrificed relationships, ignored his health, alienated his family, all in the name of building quantum tech. What was left now? A fortune in dollars, euros, and cryptocurrencies, but a vacuum where a life should have been. The irony was cruel. He, who boasted of predicting market fluctuations, of anticipating the next big deal, had been completely blind to the conspiracy forming right under his nose. Her name haunted him again, Dr. Eleanor Vance. He tried to remember her, Anna, the custodian, a silent, anonymous presence in his world of brilliance and excess. He saw her almost every day, but never truly saw her. She was part of the furniture, a functional component of the environment, like the air conditioning or the coffee machine. How many times had he walked past her in the hallway without a good morning? How many times had he ignored her while she cleaned the floor under his feet? The memory of her calm gaze while he humiliated her burned him inside. There was no hatred in those eyes, nor fear, just quiet observation, an evaluation. She was measuring him, weighing him, and found him wanting. The room door opened again. It was Stephen. He entered without the deference of before. His face was serious, his shoulders straight. He was no longer the subordinate. "Robert, we need to discuss the practical details," he said, his voice firm. Robert stopped pacing and faced him, fury and pain mingling in his eyes. "Why, Stephen? After all these years, why?" Stephen looked him in the eyes, and for the first time, Robert saw not betrayal, but a deep, old sadness. "Because you built a company, Robert, but you never built a team. You accumulated a fortune, but you lost your humanity in the process. The board could no longer risk the future of quantum tech on someone who values profit more than the people who generate it. Someone had to stop you." He paused, his gaze shifting to the window. "I genuinely hoped you would see what you were becoming, but you were too blinded by your own wealth." Before Robert could respond, Stephen placed a leather folder on the table. These are the terms. They are generous. The board wants a clean transition, without scandals. Stephen's final tone made it clear there was no room for negotiation. The door closed again, leaving Robert with the folder, the solitude, and a devastating question. Who was he, without quantum tech? The night dragged on like a wounded animal. Robert didn't go home, to his opulent penthouse overlooking Central Park, a marble and glass retreat that suddenly seemed empty and cold. He remained in his office, the fortress from which he commanded his empire, now the scene of his vigil. Manhattan's lights glittered outside, a galaxy of lives and stories indifferent to his personal implosion. The leather folder Stephen had left remained untouched on the table, a sinister object whose contents he feared more than any loss report on the stock exchange. Opening that folder would mean accepting reality, and a part of him still desperately clung to denial. He spent hours scouring the internet, his wounded pride desperately seeking a flaw, a stain on Dr. Eleanor Vance's name. Who was she? Where had she come from? He found fragments, academic papers in obscure quantum physics journals, mentions of a brilliant thesis defended with honors at MIT, a grainy photograph at a symposium in Geneva. She was a ghost, a brilliant mind operating in the shadows of academia, far from the corporate spotlights he so coveted. There was nothing, no controversy, no scandal, just a trail of intellectual excellence that made him feel even smaller. The discovery only deepened the mystery and his own impotence. She wasn't a business rival he could attack or buy. She operated on a different plane, a universe of logic and principles that his money couldn't touch. Her weapon was truth, and he had no defense against it. Dawn painted the sky gray and orange, and with it came an exhausting clarity. The fight was over. He picked up the phone and called his lawyer, a man accustomed to fierce corporate battles. The voice on the other end of the line, usually confident and combative, became hesitant and grim as Robert recounted the events. "This is unorthodox, Robert," the lawyer said, "but if the Zurich board is unified, and with the endorsement of an external auditor of this caliber, our options are extremely limited. Stating this publicly would destroy the value of your shares. The best we can do is negotiate the terms of your exit to protect your assets." The word assets sounded hollow. Protect his possessions, his assets, his investment funds. Was that all that remained? Finally, with trembling hands, he opened the folder. The documents were organized with surgical precision. A generous severance package that would secure him an even greater fortune. In exchange for his silence and cooperation, a non-compete agreement, a draft press release that praised him as the visionary genius who would now seek new challenges. It was a well-orchestrated farce, a piece of theater for the financial markets. But buried in the middle of the legal jargon, one clause caught his attention. The transition would be personally overseen by Dr. Vance. For a period of 30 days, he would have to work with her, hand over every project, every strategy, every secret of quantum tech to the woman who had exposed him. The idea was as repugnant as it was terrifying. To be forced into daily proximity with the architect of his humiliation, to face every day the calm, analytical gaze that saw through his billionaire facade. It was the final punishment, more cruel than the loss of his title. It was an exile within his own kingdom. The office door opened at 9 sharp. It wasn't Stephen who entered, but Anna. She no longer wore the custodian uniform. She wore a simple but elegant tailored suit, her hair pulled back into a professional bun. The only thing that remained the same were her eyes, calm and unfathomable. She didn't sit down. She remained standing across the vast mahogany desk, creating a formal distance between them. "Good morning, Robert," she said, her voice neutral, without a hint of triumph or pity. "Have you read the documents?" He merely nodded, unable to formulate a word. Then you understand that, starting today, and for the next 30 days, you will report to me. My goal is to ensure a smooth transition that preserves the company's value and the well-being of its employees. I expect your full cooperation. She looked directly into his eyes, and he saw, for the first time, not an academic or a custodian, but a leader. A leader who had just claimed his throne. Our first meeting is in 5 minutes in the war room. Don't be late. The hallway leading to the war room had never seemed so long. Each of Robert's steps echoed in the polished silence of the floor, a hollow sound hammering in his head. He felt the eyes of employees from other departments through the glass partitions, curious glances, veiled whispers. The news, no doubt, had already spread like wildfire through the company intranet. The king had been dethroned. Upon reaching the door, he hesitated for a fraction of a second, taking a deep breath to construct a mask of indifference. When he entered, the scene that greeted him was worse than he had imagined. The engineering team was there, the same team that had witnessed his humiliation the previous afternoon. They were seated around the table, but the dynamic was completely different. The tension had dissipated, replaced by an atmosphere of intense, almost academic concentration, and in the place of honor, the head of the table that had always been his, sat Anna. She didn't sit as he did, reclining with dominating arrogance. She was leaned forward, calmly discussing something on a tablet with the young chief engineer, Liam, who looked at her with a reverence previously reserved for Robert. Stephen was at her side, like a faithful advisor. No one seemed to notice his arrival immediately. He cleared his throat, a pathetic sound that was lost in the vastness of the room. It was Liam who saw him first, and a blush of embarrassment rose on his face. Anna looked up, and her gaze held him. "Robert, sit down," she said, pointing to an empty chair in the middle of the table, neither at the head nor in the center of power. A mere participant's chair. Swallowing the knot of pride in his throat, he obeyed. The meeting began, and it was a masterful lesson in deconstruction. Anna didn't attack him, she ignored him, which was infinitely worse. She addressed the team with a clarity and respect he had never employed. She didn't talk about profits or stock prices. She spoke of the beauty of mathematics, the elegance of the solution, transforming their collective failure into a valuable lesson. The error in the initial approach, she explained, using the large whiteboard to draw new diagrams, was treating the problem as linear, but quantum encryption doesn't operate on binary logic. It is a spectrum of probabilities. The capital we invested in development wasn't lost. It merely showed us the path we shouldn't have taken. She asked questions, listened to the answers with genuine attention, validated the concerns of the younger engineers. She was, brick by brick, rebuilding the team morale that he had broken. Robert felt like a ghost at his own funeral. His opinion was not solicited. His presence was merely a formality. He was a liability, a footnote in the history of the company he founded. Then, the focus of the meeting shifted. Anna began to discuss the financial implications of the new solution, the expected profitability, the impact on cash flow, and the new applications that might arise. It was then that she turned to him. "Robert, the original business plan projected a 6-month testing phase. With this new matrix, we can reduce that to 6 weeks. I need you to prepare a new revenue projection report based on this accelerated schedule." The question was professional, direct, but to him, it was like being ordered to project the profits of his own scaffold. He responded in monosyllables, his voice hoarse. "Yes, understood. I will do that." Each word was a shard of glass in his throat. After an hour that felt like an eternity, Anna concluded the meeting. "Excellent work, team. Liam, I want you to lead the implementation. Keep me informed." The engineers stood up, a new energy in their steps, chatting animatedly among themselves. They left the room, passing Robert as if he were invisible. He got up to leave too, desperate for air, for solitude. As he was about to cross the threshold, Anna's calm voice stopped him. "Robert, wait." He turned around. She was alone in the room, organizing some papers. She didn't look up when she spoke. "Just one more thing. Reviewing the old balance sheets. I need you to explain the acquisition of Project Orion 3 years ago. My records show a significant capital outflow that doesn't seem to align with the final valuation of the assets that were integrated. Project Orion." The name dropped into the silence of the room like a stone in still water, the ripples spreading cold and fast through Robert's body. Of all the points she could have questioned, of all the deals and acquisitions he had made over a decade, she had chosen precisely that one. Project Orion wasn't a common transaction. It was his most closely guarded secret, a ghost in his accounting, buried under layers of corporate jargon and dazzling financial reports. It was a personal project, a side bet made with company funds, a daring move that, if discovered, could be interpreted not as an aggressive investment strategy, but as something much worse. A breach of purpose, a break of trust that would make his arrogance with the engineers seem a mere social faux pas. He felt a drop of sweat trickle down his temple. How did she know? How did she, amidst terabytes of data, manage to sniff out that specific trail, that anomaly that even the most rigorous auditors hadn't noticed in years? It was a strategic intellectual property acquisition, he replied, struggling to keep his voice steady, not to let the sudden wave of panic show. A small tech startup with promising patents. We ended up absorbing the team and shelving most of the projects, typical of the sector. He tried to sound casual, as if explaining an insignificant footnote, but Anna finally looked up from her papers, and the intensity of her gaze instantly dissolved his facade. She wasn't accusing, she was simply observing, waiting for him to entangle himself in his own lie. "Strange," she said, with disarming calm. "Because, cross-referencing the startup's payroll data with Quantum Tech's employee records, I found no overlap. No member of the Project Orion team was integrated. Furthermore, the startup headquarters was a residential address in a modest neighborhood in Astoria, Queens. And the only registered director was a 72-year-old man named Samuel Rodriguez." Every word was a precise blow, dismantling his lie piece by piece. Samuel Rodriguez, his father, the man in the picture frame on his desk. Robert felt the blood drain from his face, leaving him pale and cold. Project Orion had been his attempt to give his father a dignified retirement, an inheritance he wouldn't accept otherwise. He had created the shell company, bought some useless patents, and acquired it for an inflated value, channeling a portion of Quantum Tech's fortune into his father's account under the guise of a legitimate business. It was an act driven by a mixture of love, guilt, and pride. A tortuous way of taking care of the man who had sacrificed everything for him, without the proud, old bricklayer ever knowing that his nest egg came from his son's corporate capital. Eleanor stood up and walked slowly toward him, rounding the table. She didn't stop in front of him, but beside him, looking out at the same panoramic view of the city he had so often contemplated. "I found no evidence that Samuel Rodriguez personally benefited from that transaction," Robert Sanchi continued, her voice now softer, almost reflective. "All the capital transferred in the acquisition was reinvested in its entirety into a scholarship fund for low-income young people to pursue engineering at MIT, a fund which, I discovered, has been solely responsible for anonymously sponsoring almost a dozen students over the past 3 years." She turned to him, and for the first time, he didn't see an auditor or an executive. He saw something he couldn't decipher, an emotional complexity that stunned him. "Liam Murphy, your chief engineer, the young man you humiliated yesterday, he was the first scholarship recipient from that fund. Without Project Orion, he never would have left his community, He would be working in a mechanic's shop, not solving quantum matrix equations. Robert's world spun. The act he considered his greatest vulnerability, his darkest secret, was the source of a good he had never imagined. His flawed attempt to care for his father had, by a twist of fate, transformed the lives of young people like Liam. The very person he had scorned. The shock of the revelation left him speechless. He looked at Eleanor, confused, awaiting the final blow, the accusation of fraud. But she simply observed him, her face a blank canvas. "The board doesn't know this." "No one does," she said quietly. "The only question I have for you, Robert, is why? Why?" Eleanor's question, devoid of accusation and laden with genuine curiosity, broke Robert's last defense barrier. It wasn't the question of an auditor hunting for fraud, but of someone trying to understand the man behind the numbers, the heart behind the armor of arrogance. The tension that held him rigid broke, and he felt his shoulders sag under the weight of years of secrets and solitude. He moved away from the window, the panorama of his success now an insignificant blur, and walked to the glass wall where, less than 48 hours ago, his life had collapsed. His fingers traced the erased remnants of his failed equation. "My father," he began, his voice hoarse, choked by an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel for decades. "He's a simple man, a bricklayer. He spent his entire life with his hands covered in cement, building houses for others, while ours barely stood upright." He turned to face Anna, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "He sacrificed everything so I could study. He sold the car, worked overtime until he almost passed out from exhaustion, to pay for my first programming classes. When I got into MIT, it was the first time I saw him cry. He used to say that the greatest asset he could leave me was education, since he had no inheritance, no possessions to offer." Robert paused, the memory so vivid it felt like yesterday. "When I started making money, serious money, he wouldn't accept anything. He said it was my merit, my achievement. I tried to give him a house, a car, a comfortable life. He refused everything. He said his pride wasn't for sale." The frustration and love in his voice were palpable. He was getting older, his back hurting, his hands deformed by work. I couldn't bear the thought of seeing him finish his life with so little, so I created Project Orion. It was meant to be his pension fund, a shell business that would give him an income without him knowing it came from me. I was supposed to be the only one who knew. He looked at the floor, shame and confession weighing upon him. I didn't know what he had done with the money. A scholarship fund. That is totally him. Instead of saving it for himself, he used what he thought was the profit from his business to give other young people the same chance I had. Silence returned to fill the room. But this time it was a different silence, charged with understanding. The revelation had completely reconfigured Eleanor's image of him. The tyrannical, humiliating CEO was also a son who loved his father in a clumsy, desperate way, using the tools he knew, financial engineering, secrecy, capital, to express a feeling he couldn't put into words. Eleanor approached, her expression softened. "Your father created a legacy, Robert, a legacy of opportunity, and you, even without knowing it, were the instrument of it." The absence of judgment in her voice was what finally broke him. He sat down in one of the chairs, the same one where he had been relegated to ostracism hours earlier, and buried his face in his hands. The facade of the unshakable billionaire crumbled, revealing only a man confronted with the complexity of his own actions. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice muffled. "Are you going to tell the board?" Eleanor watched him for a moment, her brilliant mind processing the new variables. Her audit was about leadership, about company culture, and what she had just discovered was the most crucial piece of the puzzle. It showed a serious ethical lapse, a manipulation of funds that, in any other context, would be grounds for summary dismissal and perhaps even legal action. But it also revealed a deeply human motivation, a seed of altruism that, ironically, had blossomed and borne wonderful fruit. Like Liam's talent. What happens now, she said slowly, thinking aloud, depends on what you do next. The information for now stays between us, but the situation needs to be rectified. And your father's legacy, perhaps it's time for it to be recognized in a way that doesn't involve shell companies. She looked at him, a new challenge in her eyes. You built an empire based on algorithms and profit, but perhaps the most important equation of your life doesn't involve numbers, but people. Eleanor's words echoed in Robert's mind for the rest of the day, overlapping with the financial reports and market projections that previously consumed all his attention. The most important equation doesn't involve numbers, but people. It was a concept as foreign to him as the theoretical physics she mastered. His world had always been quantifiable, reduced to performance metrics, return on investment and percentage growth. People were resources, pieces on a corporate chessboard, moved to maximize profit. The revelation about his father's scholarship fund, financed by his secret maneuver and responsible for Liam's success, forced him to confront the limitation of his own worldview. For the first time, he saw the impact of his actions not on a stock chart, but on the real life of a human being. The young engineer he had humiliated was, in a very real sense, a product of his distorted filial love. The irony was overwhelming. That afternoon, Eleanor summoned him to another meeting, but this time it wasn't in the imposing war room. It was in a small conference room, without the cutting-edge technology and panoramic view. Just a simple table and 2 chairs. The change of scenery was deliberate, stripping the conversation of any formal hierarchy. She didn't start with business. "Tell me about Liam," she requested, with a direct simplicity that disarmed him. Robert hesitated. What did he know about Liam? The name of the university on his resume, his specialization, his performance on projects, facts, data. "He's brilliant," Robert replied, the automatic answer of a CEO evaluating a valuable asset. "One of the best coders I've ever hired. Quick, efficient." Eleanor looked at him, waiting for more. Her silence pressured him to dig deeper, to seek something beyond the professional, and he realized, with growing discomfort, that there was nothing. He didn't know where Liam came from, what his dreams were, if he had family. He knew nothing about the man whose career he had inadvertently financed. "Is that all you know?" she asked, without judgment, but the question struck him like a sharp criticism. "Robert, quantum tech isn't a machine. It's a living organism, composed of people. People like Liam, people you led but didn't know." She leaned forward, the intensity in her gaze forcing him not to look away. "The board removed you for your arrogance, for your lack of empathy. But what I discovered about Project Orion shows me that empathy isn't dead in you. It's dormant, buried under layers of ambition and the pressure to generate ever more wealth. The question is, do you want to wake it up?" The question hung between them. It wasn't about saving his job. It was about saving himself. He could continue as he was, a bitter and lonely billionaire, protected by his fortune, or he could try to understand the equation she had presented to him, the equation of people. "I don't know how," he admitted, the confession a whisper, the most vulnerable act he had ever performed in his adult life. A small smile, the first he had seen on her, touched Eleanor's lips. "No one knows at the beginning. It's like learning a new programming language. You start with the fundamentals." She pushed a tablet across the table toward him. On the screen, a file was open. It was the proposal for a new project. "The Samuel Rodriguez Scholarship Fund," the title read. "The board approved my suggestion to formalize the initiative. We will transform Project Orion into an official, fully transparent, and legal social responsibility program for quantum tech. We will expand it, funding dozens of new students every year." He read the details, astonished. The proposal was brilliant. transforming his legal liability into a public relations asset and, more importantly, into a real legacy. And then he saw the last line of the proposal: Program Director to be appointed. Eleanor looked at him, challenge and opportunity contained in her gaze. The program needs a director, Robert, someone who understands both finance and the importance of education, someone who has a personal connection to the fund's mission. She wasn't offering him a consolation prize. She was offering him a chance at redemption. The decision, he knew, was the most important of his life. Eleanor's proposal lay before Robert, the tablet screen illuminating the room with a cold, promising light. Director of the Samuel Rodriguez Scholarship Fund. The title was, at once, an honor and a humiliation. To go from CEO of a billion-dollar corporation, a titan of the stock market, to the director of an internal charitable program seemed a dizzying fall. His ego, wounded but still alive, screamed in protest. It was a position without the power, without the prestige, without the potential to generate the fortune to which he had become accustomed. It would be a behind-the-scenes job, dealing with students, universities, and bureaucracy, far from the adrenaline of closing a multi-million-dollar deal or seeing his stock price soar. Yet, there was something else. The name Samuel Rodriguez, seeing his father's name, the humble bricklayer, stamped on an official quantum tech program, the company that was the symbol of everything that separated them, awakened a deep and complex emotion in his chest. It would be the final validation of his father's sacrifice, a monument to his legacy of integrity and altruism, built within the walls of his son's empire. He thought about his father. He imagined the expression on his face upon hearing the news: pride, confusion, maybe even a little disappointment at having been deceived, even with the best intentions. And he thought of Liam, of how that talented young man, almost lost to the world, was living proof that the greatest return on an investment could not always be measured in dollars or euros. The cash flow of that business wasn't monetary, it was human. "Why are you doing this?" Robert asked, his voice low, seeking to understand Eleanor's motivation. "You could have used Project Orion to destroy me completely. Why give me an out, a chance?" Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her gaze briefly lost on the white wall of the room, as if she saw equations only she understood. "Because destroying is easy, Robert. Anyone can break things. Building is what requires skill. My job here wasn't to punish you. It was to ensure the health and future of quantum tech. And a healthy company doesn't throw away its most complex assets. It reconfigures them." She turned her gaze back to him, direct and without artifice. "You are a complex asset. Your business mind, your ability to turn capital into results, is undeniable. But it was being misapplied, focused only on one type of profit. I'm not offering you an exit. I'm offering you a new problem to solve, a problem much more difficult than quantum encryption: how to transform wealth into human value." The clarity of her reasoning was impressive. She wasn't acting out of pity or kindness, but out of superior strategic logic. She saw a potential in him that he himself had forgotten existed, buried under the weight of his own success. He was a genius at creating systems, at optimizing processes, and she was handing him a broken system, his own legacy, and challenging him to fix it. The decision formed in his mind, not as an explosion, but as the solution to a long and complex equation. The final answer, the only one that made sense. He slid the tablet back across the table. "I accept," he said. The words sounded strange in his own mouth, devoid of his usual arrogance, but filled with a weight and sincerity he hadn't felt in years. For the first time in days, he didn't feel like a dethroned king, but like a man facing a new beginning. The loss of his CEO title, which once seemed like the end of the world, now revealed itself as a liberation from constant pressure, from the loneliness at the top, from the insatiable hunger for more. Eleanor nodded slowly, a single gesture of recognition. Excellent. Your first assignment is to prepare a presentation for the fund. You will deliver it personally to the entire company on Friday, and afterward, you and I are going to make a visit. A visit? Where? Robert asked. Eleanor stood up. The meeting clearly concluded. We're going to Astoria, Queens. I think it's time you introduced your new boss to your father. The days that followed were the strangest and most intense of Robert's life. He dove into the task of structuring the Samuel Rodriguez Fund presentation with the same obsession he once dedicated to an initial public offering. He spent hours locked in his old office, now a transition space, no longer strategizing to dominate the market, but researching non-profit management, social impact, and educational programs. For the first time, his work was aimed not at increasing his net worth, but at honoring his father's. With every slide he created, every anonymous testimonial from a former scholarship recipient he read, a layer of his cynicism dissolved. He began to see the world not just as a market to be exploited, but as a network of human connections, of potentials to be nurtured. Eleanor gave him full autonomy, but observed him from afar, offering pointed guidance, a subtle questioning that forced him to think differently. Don't talk about the money, Robert, she advised him at one point. This talk about the transformation. No one is inspired by a balance sheet, but everyone connects with a story of overcoming. He also had to interact with Liam, not as a boss, but as a colleague. At first, the awkwardness between them was almost palpable. Liam still saw him as the tyrannical CEO, and Robert felt guilty and ashamed every time he looked at the young man. It was Robert who broke the ice. Liam, I need your help, he said one day. Approaching the engineer's desk, I'm preparing a presentation about the fund that financed your studies. I would like to know your story, if you feel comfortable sharing. Liam was surprised, but saw a sincerity in Robert's eyes he had never seen before. Hesitantly at first, he began to speak. He spoke about his childhood, about the dream of being an engineer that seemed impossible, about the scholarship acceptance letter that changed his life. As he listened, Robert no longer saw a subordinate, but the personification of his father's legacy. At the end of the conversation, something had changed. Thank you, Liam, Robert said, genuinely. My father would be very proud of you. Friday arrived. The Quantum Tech auditorium was packed. The news of Robert's departure and the creation of the fund had generated a whirlwind of rumors. Everyone was there to see the fallen king give his final speech. When he stepped onto the stage, the silence was heavy. He looked at the faces in the audience, engineers, analysts, marketing staff, even the cleaning crew, who were invited to a general meeting for the first time. He saw Eleanor in the front row, her face serene and encouraging. He took a deep breath and began to speak, but it wasn't Robert, the CEO, talking. There was no corporate jargon, no growth charts. It was just Robert, Samuel's son. He told the story of his father, the bricklayer. He spoke of the sacrifice, the pride, the love he only knew how to express through a complicated and misguided financial transaction. He spoke of the fund, not as an act of corporate charity, but as the continuation of a simple man's dream. And then he spoke of Liam, pointing to the young man in the audience, who blushed but also smiled. I built this company to be rich, Robert said, his voice husky. But my father, without a single cent of profit, made it valuable. At the end, there wasn't the thunderous applause of a shareholders meeting after a dividend announcement. There was something deeper, a warm, respectful applause that started slowly and grew in volume, filling the auditorium. It was applause not for the billionaire, but for the man. Later that day, a discreet car took them away from the luxury of Lower Manhattan toward the simpler streets of Astoria, Queens. Robert felt his heart pounding erratically. Facing a room full of hostile investors was easy. Facing his father with the truth was the most terrifying thing he had ever done. The car stopped in front of a small but impeccably kept house with a small garden in front. An older man with white hair and thick hands was watering the flowers. He looked up when the car stopped, a smile emerging on his face when he saw his son. "Robert, what a surprise! And who is the pretty lady?" Samuel said, his voice warm and welcoming. Robert got out of the car, Eleanor beside him. "Dad, this is Anna, and we need to talk. I have something to tell you." Samuel led them inside, to the small living room Robert knew by heart since childhood. The smell of fresh coffee hung in the air, a cozy constant in his memories. The house was the antithesis of his world, simple but well-maintained furniture. Family photos on every surface, an environment that didn't exude wealth, but love. They sat on the worn sofa, and Robert's grandeur, the billionaire CEO, seemed to shrink until he became just a son, nervous under his father's curious and affectionate gaze. The words wouldn't come. How could he begin to explain a decade of deception, even if well-intentioned? It was Eleanor who, with her usual calm, initiated the conversation. "Mr. Rodriguez, my name is Eleanor Vance. I work with your son, and we came today because we discovered something extraordinary that you did." Samuel laughed, a husky, genuine sound. "Extraordinary. My dear, the most extraordinary thing I do these days is manage to get out of bed without my back complaining. What are you talking about?" Robert took a deep breath. It was now or never. "Dad, remember that little tech company you ran for a while? Project Orion." Samuel's face lit up with the memory. "Ah, yes, good times. I never really understood those computer businesses, but the money we earned there was a blessing. It helped out some good boys. You know." He spoke with disarming simplicity, having no idea of the complex financial web his son had woven around him. "Dad, the company wasn't real," Robert said, his voice low. "It was me. The money came from quantum tech. It was a way I found to take care of you. Since you never accepted my help." Samuel looked from his son to Eleanor, confusion slowly transforming into understanding in his tired eyes. The smile vanished, replaced by a serious, indecipherable expression. He didn't seem angry, but deeply thoughtful. "So, all that money was yours?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Yes, Dad." The silence that followed was the longest of Robert's life. He braced himself for disappointment, for the rage of having his pride wounded. But Samuel did not look at his son with anger. He looked at his own hands, calloused and marked by a life of hard work. "I always told you, my son, that the greatest asset a man has is not what he keeps in the bank, but what he builds with his own hands. I built walls. You built an empire of numbers I never understood." He lifted his gaze, and there were tears shining in his eyes. "But knowing that the fruit of your labor, even by a crooked path, helped build the lives of those young men, that makes me prouder than any house I ever put up." He leaned over and, for the first time in years, pulled his son into a strong hug, an embrace that smelled of earth and dignity. "You are a good man, Robert. You just forgot how to be one. Maybe you needed someone." He looked at Eleanor with a gentle smile, "to show you the map back." In that embrace, decades of distance and misunderstanding dissolved. Robert felt the weight of his empire, his solitude, his ego, simply disappear. He was no longer the CEO, the multi-millionaire, the defeated genius. He was just Samuel's son, silently crying on his father's shoulder. Later, while having coffee, Robert told his father about his departure from the presidency and his new role as director of the fund that would now bear his name. He expected a protest, a lament for the loss of his son's status. Instead, Samuel's face broke into the biggest smile Robert had ever seen. "Director of the Samuel Rodriguez Fund," he repeated, savoring the words. "Now that's a title I understand. A title that builds something real." Eleanor, who had remained a silent and respectful observer, finally spoke. "Your son has the opportunity to create the greatest legacy of all, Mr. Rodriguez. A legacy that will generate interest of opportunity for generations. Samuel looked at Robert, pride radiating from him. I always knew you were a good investment, son. In that moment, in that small room, Robert finally understood the true meaning of wealth. It wasn't in his assets, his stocks, or his Bitcoin account. It was right there, in the pride in his father's eyes and the promise of a future where his capital could, finally, serve a greater purpose. The transition wasn't just complete, the transformation had begun. A month later, Quantum Tech was a different company. The atmosphere of fear and pressure Robert had cultivated was replaced by a current of collaboration and respect, driven by Eleanor's calm and incisive leadership. She, now officially named interim CEO by the Zurich board, commanded not with orders, but with questions, encouraging innovation to flourish from the bottom up. The solution to the encryption algorithm, which saved the company, was internally named the Vance Theorem, a tribute to the woman who saw beyond the numbers. Stephen, rejuvenated, acted as her right-hand man, the old guard ensuring the new culture took root in the company's financial structure. The transition was smooth, the stock price remained stable, and internally, team morale hit an all-time high. The story of the humiliation in the war room and the subsequent revelation became a corporate legend, a constant reminder that an individual's true value is not in their title, but in their character. Robert, for his part, found his place far from the CEO's office. His new office was smaller, more functional, and its walls were not adorned with stock market charts, but with photos of the young students benefiting from the Samuel Rodriguez Fund. He dove into his new role with a dedication that surprised everyone, including himself. He used his financial genius not to multiply his net worth, but to optimize the fund's resources, creating partnerships with universities and companies to ensure not only the students' education, but also their employability. He became a mentor, regularly talking with the students, sharing his experience, both his successes and, more importantly, his failures. He discovered a talent he didn't know he possessed, inspiring others not through power, but through vulnerability. His relationship with Liam transformed into a genuine friendship based on mutual respect. Liam, now the head of the encryption department, frequently sought Robert's advice, not about equations, but about leadership and career. Robert saw him no longer as a subordinate, but as the living proof of his father's legacy and the promise of a bright future. One sunny afternoon, Eleanor entered Robert's office. "I have news from Zurich," she said, sitting in the chair opposite his desk. "The board is extremely satisfied with the transition and the results. They offered me the permanent CEO position." Robert smiled, a sincere smile with no hint of envy. "No one deserves it more than you, Eleanor. You didn't just save an algorithm, you saved the soul of this company." "I had help," she replied, her gaze acknowledging his role in the transformation. "And they also had a proposal for you. They want you to take a seat on the board as a strategic consultant for investments and philanthropy. Your expertise is very valuable." The offer was an olive branch, an acknowledgement that he still had much to contribute. It was a bridge back to the world of power he had left behind. A year ago, he would have leaped at the opportunity. Now, he considered it with a calm he had never possessed. "It's an honor," he said, "but my place is here. My work with the fund is just beginning. There are many other Liams out there waiting for a chance. That's the only business whose profit I'm interested in increasing now." Eleanor smiled, satisfied with the answer she already expected. "I figured you'd say that." She stood up to leave, but stopped at the door. "By the way, I got an email from your father." Robert raised his eyebrows, surprised. "My dad, he barely knows how to turn on a computer." "He asked one of the scholarship recipients to help him write it," Eleanor explained. "He invited me for coffee at his house next Sunday, and he said to bring that grumpy ex-boss of yours who seems like a person now." Robert laughed, a light, genuine sound. His father's teasing was the purest form of love he knew. "I think I can squeeze that into my schedule," he replied. When Eleanor left, he leaned back in his chair and looked out the window. He had lost an empire, but gained himself. His fortune in dollars and euros hadn't diminished, but his definition of wealth had expanded infinitely, now including assets that no balance sheet could ever quantify: respect, purpose, and most valuable of all, human connection. Sunday arrived with the clear blue sky of Queens, a rarity that felt like a good omen. The small house in Astoria was full of life. Samuel, in an apron proudly stained with tomato sauce, commanded the kitchen, while some of the young scholarship recipients, who had become regular visitors to the house, helped set the table in the backyard. The visit for coffee had transformed, at Samuel's insistence, into a Sunday lunch, complete with homemade pasta and lively conversations. Robert arrived with Eleanor, not in a luxury car with a chauffeur, but in his own vehicle, which he now drove with a rediscovered pleasure. He didn't carry an executive folder, but a platter with a dessert he had attempted to prepare himself, with comically disastrous results that made his father laugh out loud. Seeing the scene, young people from diverse backgrounds, full of dreams and potential, sharing a meal with his father like a large, improvised family, Robert felt a wave of contentment so profound it momentarily took his breath away. That was the true result of his actions. That was his legacy. He and Eleanor were received with warm hugs. Liam was also there, with his fiancée, chatting animatedly with Samuel about a new artificial intelligence project. The old abyss between the worlds of Lower Manhattan and Astoria, Queens, had disappeared, replaced by bridges of respect and gratitude. During lunch, conversations flowed freely. They talked about technology, the challenges of college, the dreams for the future. Robert wasn't the center of attention, and that brought him immense relief. He was just another person at the table, listening more than talking, learning from the stories and energy of those young people. He watched Eleanor, the CEO of a billion-dollar company, conversing with the same naturalness with a first-year engineering student and with his father, a retired bricklayer. She possessed an intelligence that transcended logic and mathematics, an emotional intelligence that allowed her to connect with anyone on their own level. He finally understood that her power came not from her brilliant mind, but from her compassionate heart. After lunch, while the others dispersed through the backyard, Robert found himself alone with Eleanor near Samuel's small garden. "Look at this," he said, with a gesture encompassing the whole scene. Who would have thought a wrong equation on a whiteboard could lead to all this? Eleanor smiled, looking at the flowers Samuel cared for so tenderly. The equation wasn't wrong, Robert. It was just incomplete. It was missing the human variables. She turned to him, her gaze serious but gentle. "You've changed. You're no longer the man I met in that war room." "That man needed to be humiliated to be able to see," he admitted. "You taught me a lesson that no MBA in the world could teach. You showed me that the greatest investment someone can make is in another person." They stood in silence for a moment, a comfortable silence, filled with the sound of laughter in the background. There was a new dynamic between them, a partnership that transcended the professional. "Thank you, Eleanor," he said, the two words heavy with the weight of his entire journey. "For everything." "Don't thank me," she replied. "Thank your father. The legacy was always his. You just needed to learn how to read it correctly." Robert looked at Samuel, who was now teaching a card trick to a group of amazed students. A man who, with nothing but kindness and an unshakable sense of dignity, had generated more profit than all the capital of quantum tech. The equation, finally, was solved, and the solution was, at the same time, simple and infinitely complex. A man's true net worth is measured by the wealth he creates in others.